Hi, welcome back to this lecture on bounding domains. Now that we've introduced the distinction between root, stem, word, phrase, and utterance, we'll now work through a series of English examples to illustrate these differences. Our first example comes from the process of so-called Canadian raising. Which is a process that is found in several dialects of English in North America, which is able to cross word boundaries. So I'm already telling us that this is a process that is not necessarily phrase bounded, or we actually need to determine this for ourselves. Just so you know, the dialects that have Canadian raising are found in the area of the Great Lakes. So just for your information here, the Great Lakes are the set of lakes here found in along the border between the United States and Canada. So in the sort of upper Midwest, states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota in the United States, and mostly the province of Ontario in Canada. So here is a sort of minimal pair. Let's take a sentence that reads, "She knows how to pry seals out of the crevices in which they hide," versus "I went to price eels at the market." So in this case, we can see there are two different diphthongs. There's a diphthong I on the one hand, and a slightly raised diphthong. If I can find the right symbol for it, the diphthong I. The diphthong I in this other example. And we can see in both of these cases, there is, without reference to word boundaries, there is an S immediately following. So in one case, we have pry seals, but in the other case, price eels. And if we think about where the word boundary falls, maybe in that way we can explain the difference. So looking at the segments alone, the local environments are identical. In both cases, the diphthong is immediately preceded by the rhotic, r, and immediately followed by a voiced alveolar sibilant, s. So if we didn't have knowledge of any of these boundaries, it would be difficult to explain why these two sounds could be in the same environment if we unless we attributed them to distinct phonemes. So before we try to explain the difference of these in these two phrases in greater detail, let's obtain a little more background on the process of Canadian raising and what segments actually condition its application. So here are just some words. If we were just looking at words, as we've done for the most part so far in this course, here we would see we have one set of forms on the left mostly, which usually have this raised diphthong, I, and the forms on the right have the lower diphthong, I. And we can also see, it looks to me like the distinction in terms of where we find I and where we find I is determined by the following segment. So if we look at all of the segments on the right side, b, d, z, v, n, those are all voiced segments. And compared to the ones on the left side, p, t, s, f, those are all voiceless segments. And crucially, we also find the diphthong I at the end of a word. So it appears that the diphthongs I and I, these two diphthongs, are in complementary distribution. So what does that mean? As we well know now, that means that we can attribute them to the same underlying phoneme. And since we find I both before voiced consonants and at the end of a word, that means we can write a rule that will generate I from underlying I. So this is fairly straightforward. We'll assume that the diphthong here will make our rule fairly simple, and we'll treat these diphthongs as unitary segments effectively. And we can say that then the raising of the first part of the diphthong a to occurs when it is followed by a voiceless segment. So there's our rule. Now, if we assume that this rule, if that's the segmental condition for the application of this raising process, we're calling it raising here because the vowel is higher than the vowel a. If we assume this process and we look at these two phrases, then it becomes clear what the distinction between these two phrases, pry seals and price eels, that is, determine the price of an eel, determine how much an eel costs. Where in the first instance, we have a word boundary between the word pry, to pull out, and seals. There's a boundary between the diphthong I and the segment S. But in price eels, there we have the I and the S falling within the same morphological word. So on the surface, they give the same, in producing the entire phrase, we get the same sequence, the same local environment, as we said, that is a preceding ra and a following sa. But the boundaries here make a big difference. The word boundary here is what's relevant. So the non-application of Canadian raising, the non-application of this process in the phrase pry seals, to pull the seals out of the holes, the small gaps that they like to hide in, that shows us that a word boundary is going to be present. So we can add to our rule of Canadian raising, we can add the further restriction, say that it is word bounded. And now we can look, let's take these two underlying inputs. So we have a word, we have the input pry, seals, with a word boundary in between the verb pry and the noun seals. And let's take the input price eels. So following our phonemic analysis, where we have only underlying I with two allophones, I and A, the allophone A being generated in this context, preceding voiceless sounds. Given that the raising rule, the Canadian raising rule, is word bounded, this rule finds in the, if it just scans the segmental context, it sees that I is followed by a voiceless segment, a voiceless S, but they are not contained within the same word, and therefore Canadian raising is unable to apply. On the other hand, in the sequence price eels, it finds the diphthong I followed by a voiceless segment, and that sequence of the diphthong I followed by a voiceless consonant are contained within the same phrase, and therefore the diphthong I is changed to I in that case. Price eels there. And the ultimate output then is exactly what we expect. It produces this minimal, this seeming surface minimal pair of pry seals with the diphthong, the lower diphthong I, versus price eels on the other hand, with the higher diphthong. This distinction between these two diphthongs is rather subtle and difficult here, but it makes for a nice instance, a nice example. So now in this case, we can also see how phonological processes that is the application or non-application of a phonological process, can act as a sort of so-called boundary signal. So this term derives from the work of Trubetskoy, uses the term Grenzsignal to indicate that when we find that a rule doesn't apply where its purely segmental environment would be met, that indicates that the word boundary is present. So if we see that Canadian raising should apply in this context of a diphthong I followed by S, we know that the reason that it doesn't apply must be because there is a word boundary, this Grenzsignal, present. Okay. So as a further instance in looking at boundaries, we can revisit the North American English process of tapping. Let's remember what this process does. It takes in a delayed release coronal segment. So the inputs then are coronal stops. Sounds that can undergo tapping are ta and da. And it becomes this alveolar tap, ra, when immediately followed by a non-consonantal stressless sound. So non-consonantal sounds will include in North American English any vowels, glides, as well as the usual type of North American English rhotic, ra, as also non-consonantal. And in case they're unstressed, that is, that following non-consonantal segment is unstressed, tapping will apply. So we want to try to determine here, based on this set of examples, whether tapping is limited, and specifically whether it is word bounded or not, as far as we can tell from these examples. So if we divide up these words, so we can see from the orthography, that is the spelling, what the underlying segment should be. So in general, this is not a reliable practice. This is not something you should do as a phonologist. You should not necessarily refer to the orthography for saying what the underlying sounds are. In this particular case, we can take this sort of shortcut to say that English orthography in these examples is showing us what the underlying sound is, whether it's a ta or da, but that's not so important. Okay. So here, in the first example, Minnesota males, we can have a tap occurring for this underlying ta and have Minnesota males. So in that case, all right, the ta is contained within the same word, the name of the state in the United States, Minnesota. And the tap can apply. You can hear that for me it's variable whether tapping can apply here. That will be part of our next topic in this lecture. So Minnesota, there the tap is applying inside the same word. The name Rita, the tap is able, the underlying ta is able to be tapped, is able to become a tap in that case. And similarly in the name Frida, so person's first name and their last name, Frida Lee. Now, if we look farther here we have some other phrases: grow tomatoes, three tyrannosauruses, and free deletion. So in all of these cases, it looks like the segmental context for the application of tapping would be met. So in grow, in the case of grow tomatoes, three tyrannosauruses and free deletion, the following segment in each case is a stressless vowel. I realize there's something missing from this environment. There, of course, needs to be a vowel preceding. So I'll have to adjust the handout here. Let's remember, in the environment for tapping, the environment for tapping is that there needs to be a vowel preceding and then a non-consonantal segment, a stressless non-consonantal segment following. So within these cases where we see tapping applying inside of the same word, there's a vowel applying. In these cases, we have words that begin with a alveolar stop, tomatoes, tyrannosauruses, and deletion. And having a word preceding, like three, grow, and free, which end in a vowel, provides the necessary further part for the application of tapping. But we can see in all three of these examples that tapping doesn't apply. These remain as stops. Grow tomatoes, three tyrannosauruses, and free deletion. It's not possible to say grow tomatoes, three tyrannosauruses, or free deletion. It's difficult to apply there. So in that case, this indicates to us that tapping, as far as these examples seem to show us, only applies within the boundary of a phonological word. So we can tell that the tapping rule is word bounded because we only see it applying when both the preceding vowel and the following stressless non-consonantal segment are contained within the same word. So I would add to tapping here the further restriction that this is a word bounded rule, just like we found Canadian raising to be a word bounded rule. We can now move to a different dialect of English, namely Standard British English, most or sort of received pronunciation, as it might be called, which knows another rule, which, as we'll see, turns out to be an interesting case of an unbounded rule. That is, the only thing that can break up this rule is a decided pause in speaking. This rule says that a rhotic consonant, ra, will be epenthesized, so inserted, after a vowel. I'm missing, for some reason, in my handout here, I've missed the, so in British R epenthesis, we have epenthesis of this rhotic when a vowel precedes and another stressless vowel follows. And the examples, which have been invented here using the name Kafka, as it is usually pronounced in English, the name of the author, Franz Kafka, these examples show us that this process can easily apply wherever there's some other word following. So, for instance, if we take the name alone, pronounced in isolation, we simply have Kafka. If we add the verb is after it, in Standard British English, one would say Kafka is, or add another word, pick any vowel initial word that doesn't have stress on the first syllable, and you'll have like election, and the speakers would produce Kafka relection, or the suffix, the derivational suffix ish, so still inside a word there, we would say Kafkarish in that case. In instances across word boundaries where there is stress on the initial syllable, there will usually be a glottal stop epenthesis instead, and that will block the R epenthesis. So one would say Kafka elephants and Kafka-esque. Kafka-esque, as sort of the suffix esque is a bit interesting. If that's inside a word, maybe that secondary stress conditions the application of this glottal stop in this case. Okay, so here we have items on the left showing where our epenthesis has applied, where we had a sequence of 2 vowels, and the vowel on the right was stressless. We ended up, regardless of the constituency, the morphological or syntactic structure, this R consonant was inserted. So in particular, examples like Kafka-Riz and Kafka-Relection show to us that the rule cannot be word-bounded. It's able to apply between 2 words. So for instance, let's take the word, the underlying sequence. We have Kafka, the underlying form here for the word election. Election. Probably I would consider all of these to be short es underlyingly, which then are reduced to schwas when unstressed. So I'll add a rule here of vowel reduction. Maybe to simplify things, I'll just make these into schwas to begin with. And our R epenthesis rule, the R epenthesis rule here sees that there is a sequence of 2 vowels, and the vowel on the right is stressless. So the rhotic is allowed to be inserted in this context, and we end up with the phrase Kafka-Relection. These are 2 distinct morphological and phonological words. So this tells us clearly that the R epenthesis rule is not word-bounded, and we can even see that this rule cannot be phrase-bounded, because if we take in the examples in 3 and 4, if in fluent, fast running speech, we can see clearly that in this sentence, once we have completed our study on Kafka, an important further goal will be, there's a syntactic break here where we finish a subordinate clause, and the a comma here marks the beginning of the main clause. So there is definitely a difference in syntactic structure, but in fluent, fast-running speech, a speaker of this dialect of English would say something like, here at this syntactic boundary, they would say, of Kafka risen important. So here we have 2 vowels, the final schwa of the word Kafka and the is, or sorry, the vowel of un, the schwa of the indefinite article here. The R epenthesis can apply there in this case. The only difference, there are, it can also be, this phrase can also be uttered without, or can also be said without the R epenthesis, depending upon the whether the speaker makes a decided a longer pause at the end of the subordinate clause. So if the speaker speaks more slowly and says something like, once we have completed our study of Kafka, an important further goal will be, in that case, because there's a pause, the R epenthesis does not apply. But in running speech, our study of Kafka is an important further goal, the R epenthesis is able to apply. So in this sense, R epenthesis can be said to have no bounding domain, or rather, we should better say, the bounding domain of R epenthesis is the utterance. So it's not restricted to applying within one word, and it's not even restricted to applying within the same syntactic phrase as example 4 shows, but it will apply whenever a sequence of a vowel of two vowels underlyingly stand next to each other, and the second vowel is unstressed, provided that one does not does not make a long break. Our last English example will look deeper inside instead the structure of a word. So far we've seen two rules that were word bounded, Canadian raising and tapping in varieties of North American English, and a rule that was only bounded by the utterance, so its application is only blocked when the speaker makes a pause. R appendices. This rule of L monophthongization, or monophthongization of the vowel O preceding an L, only applies within a root. So here again, we have forms from a North American variety of English. So this variety of English has, as a phoneme, the long O phoneme is underlyingly a diphthong, O, and this phoneme O has two allophones, a monophthong O and the diphthong. And the monophthong O basically arises when an L follows, when a lateral approximant follows. So if we simply try to write a rule for generating the monophthong L to account for this distribution of allophones, let's say, all right, the diphthongal phoneme O is monophthongized to O if there is a following lateral approximant, L. But based upon the data that we can see in the box here, this rule would clearly overgenerate. Why? So in the column, in the examples on the left, we have no problem. It looks like L monophthongization would work as applied, would work as assumed. So if we assume an underlying representation, holy, through this process, the underlying O will be monophthongized to O, and we obtain holy. But in the forms on the right, on the other hand, an L follows the diphthong O. So we have lowly and slowly, for instance. So that means that as written, pre-L monophthongization will overgenerate. And by overgenerate here, this term overgenerate, the term overgenerate here simply means that the rule predicts the existence of forms that shouldn't happen. We can introduce a distinction here between the terms overgenerate and undergenerate that are often used by phonologists. Overgenerate means that the rule as we have written it accounts for the forms that we want to generate through the rule, but it predicts that forms should undergo the rule that don't actually undergo it. A rule that undergenerates, on the other hand, would fail to create the forms where we need to see the application of the rule. Now, if we consider the morphological structure of these words, then we may actually be able to see a difference. So in all of the forms on the on the left hand side of the column, there the L and the underlying diphthong O are all contained within the same root. We can't we can't draw any morphological boundary between the vowel and the O. The forms on the other side, on the other hand, I'll annotate this briefly. Let's see if I can manage here. We have a derivational suffix here, li, in the adverbs lowly and slowly. Here we have a sort of compound, lowlands. So there's a morphological boundary here between low and lands. And the derivational suffix less in this case, so lacking in toes. We can contrast this with pole-less on the other side, where there is an L in the root. So the root contains the final segment of the root contains an L, and then the derivational suffix contains an L as well. So there's a boundary that we can draw here. In the word rolling, on the other hand, there's an inflectional suffix ing. The word goalie we can probably derive from the word goal, and assume that there would be a boundary here. So in short, one can say that where pre-L monophthongization does apply, the diphthong O and the following L belong to the same root. In the other cases, the environment, the following L, instead belongs to some other suffix, or in the case of the compound lowlands, would say it belongs perhaps to another word. So let's try to then fill in this derivation. We can explicitly contrast the cases of toe-less and pole-less. So in the case of pole-less, in both cases, both words undergo the suffixation of the derivational suffix less, lacking in. So let's begin with underline. With the underlying form of these roots, toe and pole. In the morphology, the suffix less is added. Let's just put that with a schwa in, since it will ultimately be pronounced with a schwa, toe-less and pole-less. Then in the phonology, the pre-L monophthongization applies. So let's restate pre-L monophthongization here to say that this is a root-bounded rule. So in this case, if we continue to look at the structure here, when we get to the phonology, so we've built a stem. We've built a new stem by adding a derivational suffix, but we have the roots remain clear to see. So the phonology then, when pre-L monophthongization looks for a possible target of application, pre-L monophthongization, we'll see that, all right, here in toe-less, I indeed have a sequence of a diphthong O followed by an L, but because the L and the diphthong O don't belong to the same root, the L is not part of the root, it can't apply. But in the sequence pole-less, here, on the other hand, the L and the diphthong do belong to the same root, and consequently, the monophthongization rule does apply, and thereby we obtain the expected forms, namely toe-less with diphthong O, but pole-less with monophthong O. All right, so now that we've seen a set of examples that illustrate cases in which a rule is word-bounded, or a rule may be stem-bounded, or in which a rule's application is essentially unrestricted, only blocked by a pause, that is the boundary of an utterance, we can then, after our break, move on to trying to clarify this concept a little further.